On the morning of July 10th, 1969, the captain of a Royal Mail ship called the Picardy spotted a small trimaran drifting alone in the mid-Atlantic, about 700 miles west of the Azores. He sounded the foghorn for a response, but nobody answered. When his men boarded the boat, they found a cabin full of clutter. There was radio equipment, books, papers, and 3 logbooks left open on the table, but there was no sign of the man who was supposed to be aboard. The boat was detained with Electron, and until that morning much of Britain had believed that her captain was on the verge of becoming a national hero. This is the story of Donald Crowhurst, the amateur sailor who tried to fake a voyage around the world. To understand what was happening on that empty boat in 1969, you first have to go back to 1967. That was the year Sir Francis Chichester returned to Plymouth after sailing around the world alone in 226 days, with only one stop in Sydney. He was knighted by the Queen and held up as the kind of adventurer Britain needed at a time when the British Empire had collapsed and the country was looking for heroes it could afford. Almost as soon as Chichester landed, sailors began asking the obvious next question: could it be done without stopping at all? A single-handed, non-stop voyage around the world without ever touching land. It had never been attempted, and no one knew if a single boat or a single person could survive that long at sea. In March of 1968, the Sunday Times turned the question into a contest. They announced what they called the Golden Globe Race. The rules were simple. Competitors had to leave from a British port between June 1st and October 31st that year. They had to sail east around the 3 Great Capes, the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Leeuwin, and Cape Horn, and return to the same port without stopping and without accepting any outside help. There were 2 prizes on offer: a trophy for the first man home and £5,000 in cash for the one with the fastest time. Today, that £5,000 would be worth roughly £75,000. 9 men entered the contest. Some of them were already legendary. Robin Knox-Johnston was a merchant navy officer. Bernard Moitessier was a French sailor with previous circumnavigation already behind him. Bill King had commanded a submarine in the Second World War. Nigel Tetley was a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy. And then there was the 9th man, Donald Charles Alfred Crowhurst. He was born in 1932 in British India. After Indian independence in 1947, his family moved back to England, and a year later his father died, leaving them in financial trouble. So Crowhurst left school early to take on an electronics apprenticeship. He was, by every account, brilliant and unreliable. He received a commission as an RAF pilot in 1953 and was asked to leave a year later for reasons that have never been made public. He then joined the Army's engineering branch and was asked to leave again in 1956 after a disciplinary incident. The pattern would repeat. He was clever, restless, charming, and somehow always on his way out of something. In 1957, he married a young woman named Claire O'Leary, and over the years that followed, they had 4 children: Simon, Roger, Rachel, and James, and settled into a comfortable house just outside of Bridgwater in Somerset. In 1962, he founded a small electronics company called Electron Utilisation. Its main product was a handheld device called the Navigator, a radio direction finder for sailors. The Navigator was, by most accounts, a clever and well-designed piece of equipment, but the company that made it was not. By the spring of 1968, Electron Utilisation was on the verge of collapse. Around that time, Crowhurst was introduced to a local businessman named Stanley Best, a caravan dealer from Taunton, who had already loaned him £1,000 to keep the company alive. Best was running out of patience, and Crowhurst, by his own later admission, was running out of options. So when the Sunday Times announced the Golden Globe Race in March of 1968, Donald Crowhurst, a man who had only ever sailed at weekends on a 20-foot slop in the Bristol Channel, decided this was the answer. He would enter the race, win the £5,000, then showcase a series of new safety inventions on his boat, save Electron Utilisation, and return home a national hero. To do this, of course, he needed a boat, so he tried to borrow Chichester's old yacht, the Gypsy Moth 4, but was turned down. He then went back to Stanley Best with a different proposal. Best would put up the money to build a new trimaran. Crowhurst would race it around the world, and the publicity from the voyage, successful or not, would catapult Electron utilization back into profit. Best agreed, but on conditions. The funding came as a loan secured against Crowhurst's house and business. If Crowhurst failed to complete the race, Best had the right to sell the boat back to Electron utilization. Given the state of the company's finances, that would effectively bankrupt the family. In other words, by signing the contract, Crowhurst was betting everything he owned on a successful voyage. The boat was a 40-foot trimaran called the twentieth Electron, designed by an American naval architect named Arthur Piver. Construction began in late June of 1968. The deadline to leave the port was October 31st. That gave the builders roughly 4 months to design, build, fit out, and test a boat unlike any that had ever attempted such a long voyage. And as you might imagine, almost nothing went to plan. Parts didn't arrive on time. The deck couldn't be sealed in fiberglass because of supply problems. Crowhurst was constantly being pulled away from the build to deal with sponsors, his PR agent Rodney Hallworth, and what was left of his crumbling business. Many of the safety devices he'd invented for the boat were never finished, including an inflatable bag at the top of the mast to prevent capsize, sensors on the hulls, and the bilge alarms. However, he told himself that he would complete them at sea. The sea trials in the weeks before departure were not encouraging. The boat leaked, the self-steering failed. Crowhurst himself fell overboard several times in port. On the final delivery sail from Crow's to Teignmouth, an experienced sailor named Lieutenant Commander Peter Eden volunteered to go with him, and apparently came away deeply worried. Eden's notes from those 2 days were, by some accounts, the last expert assessment of both the boat and the man before the race began. The night before departure, Crowhurst broke down crying in his wife's arms. He told her that the boat wasn't ready, and that he didn't think he could do it. But by then the contract with Best had already been signed, the publicity had already been organised, and the town of Teignmouth had even paid for some of the sponsorship in exchange for the boat's name. There was no way out that didn't end in financial ruin. On the afternoon of October 31st, 1968, the very last day allowed by the rules, Donald Crowhurst sailed out of the Teignmouth harbour. He told his 8-year-old son Simon to look after his mother. His family watched as the sails of the Teignmouth Electron disappeared over the horizon. The trouble began almost immediately. Within the first 2 weeks, Crowhurst had logged 1,300 miles, but only about 800 of those were along his actual planned route. He was, in his own words, making less than half his planned speed. The boat was leaking, the generator was failing, and the radio kept cutting out. By mid-November, the maths was unavoidable. There was no realistic chance the Teignmouth Electron could survive the Southern Ocean. By his own logbook, he gave himself a 50-50 chance of surviving the voyage, even if he made it that far. So he was now stuck between two impossibilities. He could turn around, return to Teignmouth, lose the boat, lose his house, lose the company, and return as a national failure, or he could press on into the roaring 40s, where his unfinished safety systems, his leaking hulls, and his lack of experience would almost certainly kill him. In late November, somewhere off the Canary Islands, he began to consider a third option. The third option was, on its face, simple. He wouldn't sail around the world at all. He would stay in the Atlantic, make fake entries in his logbooks, and loiter in the south for as many months as the real voyagers took to round the three capes. And then he would slip in behind the leaders for the return leg up the Atlantic, claiming a circumnavigation that he never actually performed. However, there were a few problems with this plan. The first was technical. Faking a logbook for a voyage that length in 1968 was an enormous piece of work. He had to reverse engineer celestial sights from positions he'd never seen. He had to calibrate his entries to weather he wasn't experiencing. And he had to do all of it in a way that would survive the scrutiny of professional sailors. According to the journalists who later investigated the case, Nicholas Tomlin and Ron Hall, this was in some ways more mathematically demanding than actually sailing the route. The other problem was psychological. Crowhurst seemed to know, even as he started, that he could not allow himself to win the race. If he came in first, his logbooks would be examined by the most experienced sailors in the world, including Chichester himself. So the plan, apparently, was to come in second or third, close enough to save his finances and his reputation, and slow enough to avoid scrutiny. In early December of 1968, he committed to the deception. On December 10th, he sent a telegram to Hallworth claiming he had sailed 243 nautical miles in a single day on December the 8th, which was a new world record for a single-handed sailor. In reality, his best run had been around 170 miles. The Sunday Times ran the news. Headlines across Britain followed. The dark horse, Donald Crowhurst, the underdog, the eccentric inventor in his small trimaran, was suddenly a contender. What the public didn't know was that by this point, Crowhurst had begun keeping 2 logbooks. One was true. It tracked the actual progress of the Tameth Electron, which never left the Atlantic. The other tracked his imaginary voyage, the Cape roundings, the weather reports, the Indian Ocean crossing, the Cape Horn passage. The two never met. In January of 1969, Crowhurst stopped using the radio entirely, blaming a failed generator. From the perspective of England, the Tameth Electron was somewhere in the Southern Ocean, fighting through the roaring 40s on a record-breaking pace. From the perspective of the boat, however, he was sailing in slow circles in the South Atlantic, drifting south towards the bottom of South America, without ever rounding it. Then in early March, the lie became something more dangerous than a lie. The leaks in the boat had become bad enough that he could no longer ignore them. So on March 6th, in clear violation of the race rules, he landed at the small port in Rio Salado in Argentina. He spent 2 days repairing the starboard hull and slipped back out to sea on March the 8th. From this moment on, he wasn't just a man inflating his progress for sponsors, he had broken the cardinal rule of the race itself. If anyone in Rio Salado ever spoke to a journalist, he would be disqualified, exposed, and ruined. And the lie that he was building over the top of it would become evidence in his disgrace, and not insurance against it. For the rest of March and into April, Crowhurst essentially loitered. He sailed slowly around the Falklands. He waited, and on April 9th, after 3 months of radio silence, he broke it with a deliberately casual message. "What's new ocean bashing wise?" he asked. He was supposedly on his way back up the Atlantic, having cleared Cape Horn. In reality, however, he had never even come close to the Pacific. For a while, the plan seemed to be holding. Then in late May, fate intervened. On the night of May 21st, the only other competitor who could possibly beat Crowhurst's elapsed time was Lieutenant Commander Nigel Tetley. Tetley was about 1,200 miles from England, racing hard to the finish on a battered trimaran of the same pivot design as Crowhurst's. He had been pushing himself, partly because he believed Crowhurst was right behind him. Around midnight, his boat began breaking apart in heavy seas. Tetley made it to a life raft and was rescued the next day. His boat went to the bottom. Robin Knox Johnston had already finished the race a month earlier, on April 22nd. With Tetley out, that meant Donald Crowhurst, the amateur from Bridgwater, was now positioned not only to finish second, but to win the £5,000 in cash prize for the fastest voyage. The very thing that he had spent 8 months trying to avoid. News of Tetley's sinking reached Crowhurst by radio in late May. Hallworth, his PR manager, was already preparing for a hero's homecoming. The BBC had a film crew on standby. Hundreds of thousands of people were expected to crowd the Tameth seafront when he sailed in. The Sunday Times was preparing the front page that would make him famous. And from that moment, his logbooks began to change. The earlier entries had been disciplined, careful navigation, terse weather notes, the meticulous bookkeeping of a man hiding a secret. But from late May onwards, the writing began to fragment. He wrote less about the boat and more about ideas. He had Einstein's special and general theory of relativity on board. He began to mix it with theology, with mathematics, and with what he called cosmic game. On June 24th, he opened a new section in his second logbook. He titled it simply, Philosophy. And over the following days, he wrote roughly 25,000 words. That's more text than the entire navigation log of the voyage. Reading it now is clearly the work of a man losing the boundary between himself and the world. He described life as a game played by cosmic beings. He described his own situation as a moral test set by the gods, and he was beginning to see clearly. He wrote about being able to leave his physical body and become what he called a second-generation cosmic being, a kind of disembodied intelligence on par with the divine. His handwriting deteriorated. Capital letters appeared in the middle of sentences. Sentences trailed off without endings. Some passages were lucid. Others read as the work of a man who was no longer certain who was writing them. Some psychologists who have studied the logbooks, including clinical psychologist Jeff Powter, have suggested that Crowhurst may have been suffering from an undiagnosed bipolar disorder, accelerated by isolation and impossible pressure. Whether that's the right diagnosis, of course, is hard to say from a distance of 50 years. His final logbook entry was made on July 1st, 1969. It was time-stamped down to the second. At 10 hours, 23 minutes and 40 seconds, he wrote that he could no longer see any purpose in the game. At 10 hours, 25 minutes and 10 seconds, he wrote that he must resign from his position. The final lines, written around 11:20 in the morning, read as follows: "It is finished. It is finished. It is the mercy." And then at 11 hours, 20 minutes and 40 seconds, "I will resign the game." That was the last thing he wrote. Sometime after that, investigators believe within minutes, Donald Crowhurst stepped off the deck of the Tamworth Electron, taking with him his ship's chronometer and what would have been his fourth logbook. The boat continued sailing slowly, alone at 2 knots, north and east, in the general direction of England. 9 days later, on the morning of July 10th, the Royal Mail ship Picardy was on her usual route from London to the Caribbean. Her crew spotted a small white trimaran drifting under a single jib at 33 degrees, 11 minutes north and 40 degrees, 28 minutes west. That was about 700 miles west of the Azores. Coincidentally, it was very close to where almost 100 years earlier the famous ghost ship Mary Celeste had been found. Captain Richard Box sounded the foghorn 3 times, but nobody answered. So he sent his men aboard, and they found a cabin in disarray, 3 logbooks, a tape recorder, a 16mm camera, and a great mass of papers. They found no body, no blood, and no sign of a struggle. The boat had been abandoned, but it had not been wrecked. One of the Picardy's crew recognised the trimaran from a newspaper drawing of the race entrance. They lifted her aboard the ship and continued on to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. The first reports back to England were uncertain. Crowhurst was missing. The boat was found, but no one yet knew what had happened. A few days later, Hallworth, the journalist Nicholas Tomlin, and a photographer flew out to meet the Picardy in Santo Domingo. They sat down with the logbooks, and with hours of opening them, they understood that the man Britain had been preparing to welcome home as a hero had never sailed around the world at all. Hallworth, by some accounts, initially tore out the pages containing the final philosophy entries, hoping to spare Crowhurst's wife. He later put them back. The full story, deception and breakdown together, was published in the British press over the weekend of July 27, 1969. The reaction was, as you might imagine, complicated. Some papers denounced him as a fraud. The headline in one read, "Lone Sailor Faked Well Voyage." Others tried to humanise him. And then there was the gesture from Robin Knox Johnston, the man who had actually won the race outright. Johnston had earned the £5,000 cash prize fairly. He had genuinely sailed around the world without stopping. But he gave every penny of it to the Crowhurst family. He told the press that nobody, having read those logbooks, could blame Crowhurst for what he had done. There was also the matter of Nigel Tetley. Tetley, if you remember, had been racing what he believed was Crowhurst the entire time. His boat had broken apart 1,200 miles from home, in part because he had been pushing too hard chasing a phantom. He survived the rescue, and his circumnavigation, completed before the boat went down, was the first ever in a multi-hulled vessel. It was a real achievement, but it was almost immediately overshadowed by the Crowhurst sensation. He was awarded a small consolation prize, but he was never able to find a sponsor for the larger boat he wanted to build next. In early February of 1972, less than 3 years after the race, Tetley was found dead in the woods near Dover at the age of 47. The coroner couldn't classify the death as suicide and recorded an open verdict. What happened in the very last minutes on board the twentieth Electron is still a matter of speculation. The most commonly accepted theory, supported by the writings and timestamps, is that Crowhurst stepped overboard deliberately. The chronometer and the missing fourth logbook went into the water with him. Some have suggested that logbook 4 contained the most damning of the false entries, and that he carried it overboard to destroy the evidence. Others believed he carried it as part of his philosophical decision, a final piece of the game he believed he was now resigning. Claire Crowhurst, his widow, was 38 years old when the news broke. She had 4 children to raise. With Knox Johnston's £5,000, the family kept the house. She made a living for years afterwards, selling antiques on a market stall. She rarely spoke publicly about her husband, and according to her son Simon, she could never quite bring herself to tell the children the full truth about what had happened. And in the years that followed, where she did speak, she pushed back against the version of her husband that had taken hold in the press. The original account by Tomalin and Hall, the journalists who'd first opened the logbooks aboard the Picardy, had presented Donald as a disintegrating fraud brought down by his own ambition. Claire argued that the picture was incomplete, that the man she had known, she said, was more than the figure in those final entries. That perspective deserves to sit alongside the standard version of the story, because it comes from someone who had every reason to know him better than the journalists did. Simon Crowhurst, who was 8 years old when his father sailed away, has spent much of his adult life living with the story. In interviews given decades later, he has spoken about how, as a boy, he and his brothers used to mark their father's progress on a map of the world by sticking pins alongside his supposed route. Through January, February and March of 1969, that ritual slowly faltered and stopped. Today, what's left of the twentieth Electron lies on the southwest shore of Cayman Brac, a small island about 300 miles south of Cuba. The cabin where Crowhurst kept his 2 logbooks is gone. The holes are open to the sky. People still find their way down to the beach to photograph her. Sailors mostly, but also tourists who've read the books or seen the films and want to stand next to the boat the man actually wrote his last words on. Someone, at some point, spray-painted Dream Boat across the stern, but nobody seems to know who. The fraud was uncovered within hours of his logbooks being opened. The man himself was never found. The boat outlasted both, drifting alone for 9 days after he stepped off her, then sold, refitted, sold again, and finally left to fall apart on a Caribbean beach, where she has been falling apart now for almost 40 years. The question that stayed with people for over 50 years is when Donald Crowhurst actually decided to step off the boat. Was it on May 21st, the night he heard Tetley's trimaran had sunk, when winning suddenly became inevitable? Was it weeks earlier, when he realised the deception couldn't survive the homecoming? Or was it always somewhere inside him, from the moment he signed Stanley Best's contract, knowing the boat couldn't survive the Southern Ocean? There's another mystery that stayed unsolved for a lot longer than this one, a case from the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, where 3 keepers vanished from a remote island off the Scottish coast in December of 1900, leaving behind a logbook full of entries that have unsettled investigators for over a century. That one's on screen now. Hopefully, I'll see you there.